Good afternoon and welcome. Thanks so much for joining our webinar session today, which will focus on the Targeted School Safety Grants for Nonpublic Schools program competitive solicitation that was recently released by the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD. My name is Sam Cook. I serve as Director of Policy and Planning within PCCD's Executive Office, and I am fortunate to be joined by some of my colleagues who will be co-presenting and facilitating today's presentation. PCCD team, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourselves? Kirsten, we can start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirsten Kenyon, and I'm the Director of the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Strategic Policy Development here at PCCD. I have the fortune of managing the School Safety Unit within my office. Now I'm going to turn things over to Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Epica. I'm Deputy Director in our Office of Financial Management and Administration.
Wonderful. All right, so before we officially begin, just wanted to go over a couple of quick housekeeping rules. First, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel as soon as it's available. And we'll also be posting a copy of our PowerPoint slides for reference. We'll make sure to email out those links and resources as soon as they're available to folks who registered, so keep an eye out in your inbox for that. We do encourage you to take a moment to check your audio settings just to make sure that you're able to hear today's presentation. Just a note that we cannot hear you on this platform. However, you will be able to submit questions through the written Q&A feature, and questions submitted by participants using the Q&A chat will not be immediately visible to all participants, but please rest assured that they have been received and will be reviewed by our team. So moving towards today's agenda, we'll be kicking things off with a brief recap of the Targeted School Safety Grants for Nonpublic Schools program funding announcement, including some important changes that have been made to the application process this year compared to prior chapters, since the grant program has moved from the Pennsylvania Department of Education, or PDE, to PCCD thanks to some recent changes in state law that we'll get into in just a little bit. We will also dive into how interested applicants can apply for funding from PCCD. We'll review a couple of important deadlines and funding timelines, and then we'll spend the bulk of our presentation on some frequently asked questions about this funding announcement and the application process that have been submitted to PCCD so far. So after we're finished going through some of those common themes from questions, we will reserve the remainder of our session today to answer any questions that are submitted by participants. We will do our best to answer as many of those submitted questions as we can during the time allotted, but if there are any that we can't get to the extent possible, we will be sure to update our funding announcement Q&A document with responses as soon as we can for your reference. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So first, wanted to do a little bit of intro about our agency for folks who may not already be familiar with us. The Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, as we are more commonly known, was established more than 45 years ago through Pennsylvania state law. We serve as the Commonwealth's Justice Planning and Policymaking Agency, and our mission is to enhance the quality, coordination, and planning within the criminal and juvenile justice systems to facilitate the delivery of services to victims of crime and also to increase the safety of our communities. So we're a relatively small state agency housed within the executive office with approximately 150 employees working across 4 different offices, including our school safety office and our grants office, as Kirsten and Chris both mentioned earlier. So PCCD is directed by an overarching commission board, which is advised by 7 different advisory committees and 2 training boards. And the School Safety and Security Committee, which is responsible for overseeing school safety and security grants and other initiatives, is also housed within PCCD. Our responsibilities and programs, as you might imagine, fall into a number of different areas, everything from funding and grants, data and research, victims compensation and services, training and technical assistance initiatives, among many other things. And if you're interested in learning more about those areas of our agency's work, we do encourage you to check out our website at pccd.pa.gov. So I'd now like to turn things over to Kirsten Kenyon, who oversees our school safety unit, to take us through a little bit about the funding announcement that you all are here to learn more about. So Kirsten, you want to take it away?
Sure thing. Thanks, Sam. Okay, so today I'm going to provide you with an overview of the Targeted School Safety Grant funding opportunity for non-public schools being administered by PCCD this year. So, as many of you may know, this particular grant program was previously administered by the Office for Safe Schools within the Department of Education. But with the passage of Act 33 of 2023, which was just signed in December of this year, this grant program was shifted to the School Safety and Security Committee under PCCD. It is now the committee's responsibility to administer these funds. Also new to fiscal year 23-24 was that funding for this grant program more than quadrupled, with $14.5 million specifically set aside in the law to go to non-public schools via their respective intermediate units. So as David Bowie would say, this means cha-cha changes in the targeted school safety grants for non-public schools grants process. While many non-public schools may already be familiar with our state agency through the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, we are well aware that this may be the first time for some of you to interact with us. So let's dance, shall we? As Sam laid out earlier, we're a separate state agency from the Department of Education. We're primarily responsible for a significant amount of grants administration on a wide variety of different funding streams. So to address this new to us, that is, program, PCCD staff did spend time gathering some information and feedback from intermediate units and non-public school stakeholders as part of this transition to try to develop a process that would work for all parties in a short period of time and under pressure. Time will tell if we are successful in our endeavors. But before we get into a step-by-step breakdown of this solicitation, we just want to draw attention to the fact that this grant program is different compared to some of the other recent grant programs that you were involved in. Also known as, we just want to provide the disclaimer upfront that PCCD's targeted school safety for non-public schools grant solicitation is different from the EAN solicitation you just went through. First, the funding being used here is state funding, and it is not federal. As a state agency, PCCD administers several federal funding streams, and we can commiserate with you that federal funding comes with all sorts of additional parameters and requirements. While I'm not saying that there won't be some requirements to be met under this program, I am saying that some of the special hoops that the feds put us all through will not be required in this grant program. Also, funding for our targeted grants is for different eligible project activities than the EAN solicitation. Our eligible project activities for this solicitation are those that are allowed by state law in section 1306-B, subparagraph J of the Public School Code. And finally, we do want to note that there are no restrictions on the targeted grant funds for permanent structures as it was under EANS. In another departure from EANS, PCCD has attempted to craft our application process to be similar to other PCCD administered grants that you may be familiar with in the past. For non-public schools that are on the call, that includes using a similar SurveyMonkey initial request process that we use for our nonprofit security grant fund program. And for the intermediate unit folks on the call, once the formal application process kicks in, we intend to use a similar process on how we issued the funding for the COVID-19 grants for non-public schools through the intermediate units, which we did back in 2020. So let's now pivot to a review of the actual funding announcement, which is actually all of the information that is provided on our Targeted School Safety Grant Program webpage on our school safety website on the pccd.pa.gov website. In case you haven't already visited it, go to pccd.pa.gov and select the School Safety and Security tab from the drop-down box on the upper right-hand side of the screen. From there, you'll be on our School Safety and Security Overview page, where we have created handy one-page sheets for each eligible school entity and other eligible applicants for school safety and security funding that we're administering at this time. For those of you on this call that represent intermediate units, you also have your own one-pager that includes information about applications IUs can make for other school safety funding, as well as information about this targeted grant program. We will be hosting other webinars later on this next week and probably over the month to address those other solicitations that are also open at this time. But I've highlighted with the little red arrow the non-public school link to their one-pager. You can click on that link, and that would take you to your one-pager which I have screenshot here. On this page, on this one pager, you'll find all the key links you need, including the direct link to the non-public school webpage on our website, which I've highlighted here with the little red arrow. This one pager, by the way, was distributed hopefully to most of you via email, but in case you didn't receive it, because we probably don't have everyone's email address, it also lives on our website as well. As always, we strongly recommend reviewing the funding announcement / webpage carefully for additional information about eligible activities and determine how your application can help fill strategic needs and gaps. As I noted earlier, a total of $14.5 million in state funds are available for the competitive targeted school safety grants for non-public schools program solicitation. Again, a significant increase over the $3 million that was typically available in previous fiscal years. Eligible non-public schools can request up to $75,000 to support proposed project activities over a 2-year period, which is both an increase in maximum award and project length time from previous years. Funds may be used for eligible activities allowed under Section 1306-B, subparagraph J of the Public School Code, or programs that address school violence by establishing or enhancing school security, including costs associated with the training and compensation of school security personnel. Now, moving on to eligible applicants. Per the law, only non-public schools that legally fulfill the compulsory school attendance requirements of the Act, the Public School Code Act, are eligible to apply. Schools that only offer pre-K and kindergarten or daycares are unfortunately not eligible since they serve students who are not covered under Pennsylvania's compulsory school attendance law. Again, as noted in Act 33, intermediate units remain the only entities eligible to submit a formal application on behalf of the non-public school to receive their award. We're going to get into that process in a little bit more detail later on in this presentation. And now I'm going to turn things over to Sam to continue on with eligible activities and priority considerations with this grant program.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So funding under this competitive solicitation can be used for a pretty wide range of both physical security enhancements, school security personnel, as well as mental and behavioral health needs that include, but are not limited to, some of the activities that you can see on this slide. So just noting that you are not limited to what you can apply for. You could come in for a multitude of items, just as long as you don't exceed that maximum cap of $75,000 per award that Kirsten just mentioned. If you're curious about that full listing of eligible project activities, that is available for reference on PCCD's school safety webpage, as well as a link on that one pager that Kirsten just walked you through. Did want to make a quick note for folks who have been around the block with us a bit on school safety funding. Activity 12 on that list, which is security, technology, and planning, we have interpreted that eligible activity pretty broadly in years past to cover a pretty significant range of activities, everything from equipment, software, etc. So that is a pretty flexible category, just that we wanted to kind of clarify for folks on this event. We will not be able to, unfortunately, answer or weigh in on specific project eligibility. For example, you know, our school wants to use money for this specific program. Is that okay? So, and that's because of the competitive nature of these grants. So we'll do our best to clarify the rules of the road as much as we can, but just know that the competitive process means we can't always weigh in on those kinds of questions. So now that we've covered the programs and activities that funding can support, let's talk a little bit about some of the priority considerations that PCCD will be factoring into our review of applications that are submitted under this competitive solicitation. So first off, priority consideration will be given for requests to address any gaps that are identified in either physical security assessments or behavioral health assessments that are conducted for the school entity that meet standards and criteria established by our School Safety and Security Committee. And just a note, if you haven't already checked those out, they are available to view and download the standards and assessment criteria by visiting the assessment criteria section of our School Safety and Security website. So the second priority consideration will be for funding requests that help school entities meet level 1 of the baseline criteria standards for physical security and or behavioral health. And those were recently revised and adopted by our School Safety and Security Committee back in May of 2023. So we'll get into a little bit more about baseline criteria in just a hot second. Worth noting, though, before we move on, that as noted on this slide, PCCD considers proposals for using funds to complete physical security or behavioral health assessments to be a level 1 baseline criteria activity. So if your school entity hasn't already completed one of those in the past, this might be something that you could consider with this funding opportunity among all of the other eligible activities that we've described so far. And then finally, PCCD will be taking geographic distribution into account when making funding recommendations, and that's a pretty standard thing that we take a look at with our solicitations. So we mentioned baseline standards, and you might be thinking and asking yourself, well, what the heck are these baseline criteria standards that they're referencing? So PCCD's baseline criteria standards were originally adopted by our School Safety and Security Committee way back in 2021, and they were really born out of a desire to help inform school entities' decisions about physical security and behavioral health and mental health needs, as their names suggest. So the standards were developed and, as I mentioned, recently revised based on input from a multidisciplinary work group that had diverse representatives from the field, both in terms of education as well as school safety, public safety, and a number of other disciplines. And so these baseline criteria standards essentially identify criteria across both physical security as well as mental and behavioral health supports that are organized across multiple levels, with the most basic foundational elements categorized as level 1, and then the more advanced criteria following at levels 2 and level 3. And so, as we covered earlier, while it's not a required aspect to come in for funding, we do strongly encourage non-public schools and their partners to review these standards and to use some of the tools and resources that PCCD has developed, just to really explore those a little bit further and do a little bit of strategic planning. Those resources include self-assessment checklist tools, where you can kind of download, go through it yourself, make some notes, see where you fall on the criteria, as well as some resource guides to help walk you through what some of those criteria mean. We also recently hosted a webinar session focused specifically on the revised baseline criteria standards. I will drop a link to that in the chat in a little bit, but that's available on our school safety page as well. So we certainly recognize that baseline criteria were developed primarily with public school entities in mind, not non-public schools. And so it is possible that some of those standards fall outside the scope and or are not required of non-public schools. But because baseline criteria standards really do reflect those basic recommendations and best practices for improving physical security and behavioral and mental health, we're considering them as factors that can help prioritize requests for funding under this competitive solicitation. And we also think that the baseline criteria offer a helpful framework for non-public schools to consider, again, as part of their overall school safety and strategic planning efforts. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris, who's going to walk us through some financial considerations and some other things to think about.
Thank you, Sam, and good afternoon again, everyone. While preparing your application, there are a few financial considerations that we thought were important to point out. First, intermediate units are eligible to receive 5% of the total amount available to assist with administration of this grant program. This is not a cost that you, as the non-public school, must build into your proposed budget. That amount for IU administration will be added to the intermediate units budget after non-public school award decisions are made. Next, under the solicitation, sustainability planning is not necessary. We recognize that many proposed costs may be one-time purchases, so providing a plan to continue your proposed project after funding ends is not necessary. Another important consideration is that per the public school code, these grant funds cannot supplant current spending on school safety and security projects by your school entity. This funding must be used to supplement your school entity's funding, which means that this funding must be used to enhance safety and security by creating new or expanding existing school safety and security programs or projects. Next, as noted previously in this webinar, this is a competitive solicitation, and if successful, your proposal may be awarded in whole or in part. Awards will be made based on the merits of the proposal and the items requested within the proposal. Following the competitive review process, successful applicants may be asked to adjust their budget based on PCCD's review. And finally, subsequent to awards being made, PCC will randomly monitor grant recipients to ensure that actual expenditures align with the approved project budget. The project is being implemented as described and approved in the application and for other compliance requirements of this grant program. One other consideration we wanted to make sure that non-public schools and their partners were aware of is that under Pennsylvania state law, any sensitive information that is included within your application for funding will not be accessible for inspection and duplication under the state's right to know law. Sensitive information is defined as anything that's reasonably likely to result in a substantial or demonstrable risk of physical harm to or personal security of staff or students. With that, I'll turn things back over to Kirsten to walk us through the application process.
Thanks, Chris. So as we've alluded to throughout this presentation, the targeted grant program for non-public schools is being set out in a multi-phase process. We're right now at phase 1, which is the initial request form via the online SurveyMonkey tool. Once the solicitation period closes, we'll move into phase 2, or reviewing and scoring the initial requests. A recommendation will be made to our committee during phase 3, and if a request is approved, PCCD will then reach out to both the non-public school applicant and their respective IU to begin the formal application process, or phase 4, within our e-grant system. Phase 5 will include when all projects are awarded and project implementation can commence. The next few slides will get into detail about phase 1, and then Sam will go over the general timeline for each of these phases. So the first step is the initial request process. Non-public schools must submit their initial request form or an application using PCCD's SurveyMonkey link, which can be found on the Targeted School Safety and Security Grants for Non-Public School webpage. Initial requests must be submitted electronically using the online SurveyMonkey form by 11:59 p.m. on February 29th, 2024. So what is in the initial request form? We modeled this survey similarly to our Nonprofit Security Grant Fund Program solicitation, which some of you may be familiar with. It's also kind of similar to our fiscal year 23-24 competitive school safety grant solicitation, which is also open at this moment. So in standard, we're asking for applicant information. So we start with an opening question asking if you meet the definition of a non-public school entity eligible to submit an initial request form under the solicitation. We also ask for general contact information for your organization and your primary contacts. Please make sure that you include accurate email addresses so that we are able to contact you. In our applicant overview section, we ask for a short description about your non-public school, including the location of the school, the total number of student-occupied buildings, and a total student enrollment figure. We also ask a description about your non-public school's experience and efforts related to improving school safety, and including any current or recent initiatives or activities you've engaged in. We also ask for any statistics related to school violence, too, because that's something that is required by law for us to ask. And we also ask for a brief description of your overall financial situation. The project description section asks applicants about whether or not they're coming in to meet any level 1 baseline criteria needs for either or both physical security or behavioral health needs. This section also includes a general executive summary for applicants to summarize their proposal, and it also asks for basic budget information. Finally, the form includes some standard assurances that you understand that you have read the funding announcement / webpage and understand the next steps in the process prior to submittal. Again, and I cannot stress this enough, applicants are strongly encouraged to carefully read and review the webpage/funding announcement and the request form reference document, which is printed out as a PDF. Do that prior to starting your actual application within SurveyMonkey. It's just best to pre-prepare all of your responses to the form prior to filling it out online and then hitting submit when you're ready. I'll now turn things over to Sam to discuss our anticipated funding timeline.
Great. So now that we have covered some of what you'll be asked to address in your application, we wanted to provide an overview of the anticipated funding timeline. So as you can see on this slide, we started this journey on January 11th when the fiscal year 23-24 school safety solicitations opened. The application deadline for the targeted school safety grants for non-public schools that Kirsten just mentioned, February 29th, is the same as it is for all of the other fiscal year 23-24 solicitations that are currently open. So happy leap year, everyone. That extra day, make it count. So after applications have been submitted, PCCD staff will review, and in the case of competitive applications like those submitted through the targeted school safety grants for non-public schools funding announcement, we'll score those submitted proposals. So our staff anticipate making funding recommendations for consideration by the School Safety and Security Committee for this grant program at their April 24th, 2024 meeting. So as noted previously in this presentation, this funding announcement is unique in the sense that it has a two-pronged application process. We're currently in the initial request phase, which involves non-public schools submitting their funding requests to PCCD directly through SurveyMonkey. Once we've cleared the review, recommendation, and approval of non-public schools requests at that April 24 School Safety and Security Committee meeting, we'll initiate phase 2 of the application process, which will require involvement from intermediate units and the submission of a formal application on behalf of non-public schools that are approved for grant funding through PCCD's e-grant system. So in an effort to streamline this process for intermediate units and others that are involved in this process, we are planning to have IUs develop and submit a single application for all of the recommended non-public schools within their IU region that are essentially going to be added as subrecipients to a single award. So this is a similar approach to what PCCD had utilized for our COVID non-public school health and safety grants a couple of years back for folks who might have been involved in that process. Once the formal applications have been submitted and finalized in e-grants with all intermediate unit and PCCD requirements met, applications will be awarded. So as noted on this slide, awards are contingent upon the successful submission and finalization of this formal application process in e-grants by an intermediate unit before awards to non-public schools can be finalized. Awarded projects will be for a 2-year period. We anticipate this beginning in July 2024 and ending in June 2026. So in terms of a recap, because we know that was a lot of information and certainly that this process is a new one for us and for you, we just wanted to take a step back and provide a brief recap. So first, eligible non-public schools have until the 29th to submit their initial funding request up to $75,000. You have to submit that to PCCD using the designated SurveyMonkey form that Kirsten mentioned. And as Kirsten mentioned, please remember to start your work outside of the SurveyMonkey form. It will make your life a whole lot easier. Once applications are submitted in SurveyMonkey, we're going to conduct a review and scoring process here at PCCD to identify the projects we would like to recommend for funding. And then once recommended projects and non-public schools are approved by the School Safety and Security Committee in late April, PCCD will engage intermediate units representing recommended non-public school applicants' geographic areas to review what was submitted and again to develop that single formal application in PCCD's e-grant system that includes all of the recommended non-public school projects as subrecipients on that single award. Awards, again, are going to be contingent on successfully completing all of the aspects of that formal application process in e-grants. And then once awards are granted to non-public schools, you all will have up to 2 years to implement your projects. So I'm now going to turn things back over to Kirsten, who's going to walk us through how to ask questions about this solicitation and cover a couple of the frequently asked questions that we've gotten so far.
Thanks, Sam. For those of you that are not familiar with our process, PCCD does allow applicants to ask questions during open competitive solicitations to seek clarification on the solicitation. As this is a competitive funding announcement, we want to make sure that everyone is receiving a similar response. So our process is to request an email so that we have the question in writing. And then what we do is we respond in kind to the original questioner via email in writing. We then post individual questions received and their answers as they come in on our website. This ensures that we have the most equitable response for all parties out there. Now, please note, calling staff is not a good idea. Staff will direct you to the email Q&A process. I mean, we understand that sometimes only navigating stuff through email can be really challenging, but it's the best process we have to ensure, again, equitable response to all eligible applicants. So with that said, how can you submit your questions? Well, today's seminar is a good place to ask. Several of you I see have already submitted questions, and we will attempt to answer them as many as we can during today's call. But if we don't get to your question, or if you happen to think of a new one in the next few days, please just email our resource account at ra-cd-npsec-grant@pa.gov. And the NPSEC is our nonprofit security grant fund resource account. And we will respond to you as soon as possible. As I just noted, since this is a competitive application, we'll also post responses to the questions received on our Q&A webpage. We highly recommend reading the online Q&A page before you reach out to us to ask a question, because it's entirely possible that someone has already asked your question and we've answered it. Also, we recommend reading the online Q&A page prior to submitting your application as well, as you may discover some nugget of information that may be helpful to you. So where do you find the Q&A document? You just need to go to PCCD's Active Funding Announcement webpage. We recommend bookmarking this page as the Q&As are updated on a fairly routine basis, and it's possible somebody, again, has already asked your question and the answer is already there. Bookmarking this page is also helpful as all of PCCD's competitive funding opportunities are posted on this page. So if we ever open up another funding opportunity that non-public schools are eligible for, you might want to be able to come back here and check it out. In case you didn't already know, the Targeted School Safety Grants for Non-Public Schools Q&A document is already available for you to read, and it includes questions and answers about eligible activities and expenses, the application process generally, and eligible entities. As noted earlier, if you go to check out the Q&A document and you don't see a question or answer that corresponds to your question, please email the ra-cd-npsec-grant@pa.gov resource account and put the title of the funding announcement in the subject line and submit your question for us to consider. Well, now, while we won't go into all of the common FAQs that we've already received in the responses, I would strongly recommend checking out the Q&A document that we already have online. We are going to highlight today some of the more frequently received FAQs that we've gotten to date. First, about eligibility. We've gotten several questions asking if daycare providers, pre-K only providers, and pre-K and kindergarten only providers are eligible for this funding. As I noted earlier in this presentation, since the grant program is tied to Section 923.3-A of the Public School Code, which limits grants to schools fulfilling compulsory school attendance requirements, and as compulsory school attendance starts at age 6 in Pennsylvania, this grant program is thus geared more towards non-public schools providing education to students grades 1 and above. We've also had some questions about what solicitations non-public schools are allowed to apply for. We would note that there are currently 4 open school safety solicitations offered by PCCD. So we understand knowing which one to look at is going to be really confusing. The Targeted School Safety Grants for Non-Public Schools is the solicitation specifically for non-public schools. So the vast majority of you will focus on this solicitation. We would note, however, that if a non-public school already works with or is seeking to partner with a municipality, law enforcement agency, or an approved vendor to provide school security personnel services, that municipality, law enforcement agency, or approved vendor can also apply for funding to support those school security personnel services to non-public schools under the 2023-24 Competitive School Safety Grant Program too. We realize that this is kind of confusing, but it's a legacy item that's left over from when they moved the grant program from the Department of Education to us. So you, as a non-public school, you can make direct application under the targeted school safety grants for school security personnel services if you like. But if you have a municipality or law enforcement agency or an approved vendor that's seeking to provide those services to you, they can also submit an application on your behalf under the competitive solicitation. We've also gotten a question as to what entities constitute an approved vendor for school security personnel services. Please refer to PCCD's School Security Guard vendor list or the original list of agencies eligible to provide school police officer services by the PA Department of Education for those approved vendors. Some additional questions we received pertain to how to apply. We want you to request all items you're interested in within a single application. You can file a single application for each separate school entity, and yes, that means separate campuses of a school if they each have their own separate AUN. The $75,000 maximum award amount applies to each individual non-public school entity, again, with a unique AUN. We would also like to note that while the initial request form does ask if your non-public school has completed a physical security assessment or a behavioral health assessment, this is not a requirement in order to be eligible for funding. Assessments, by the way, can be conducted in-house for free by your own staff. If you like, you can just use the assessment criteria toolkit that's on our website. The assessment criteria were drafted this way. It was designed to try to provide schools with a resource that they can use to assess their own gaps in physical security and behavioral health needs. But PCCD would recommend having an outside expert with the proper credentials to conduct an assessment is a preferable alternative, as it's always best to have fresh eyes on your facility and or to process or identify gaps. The next slide of the highlighted FAQs pertains to fiscal questions, so I'm going to turn that over to Chris.
Thanks, Kirsten. Two questions on this slide. First one is regarding non-supplantation and what the meaning of that is. That was covered a little bit earlier in this presentation, and the simplest description that I think I can provide is that funds must be used for new, unbudgeted, eligible safety and security costs for your school entity. And I direct you to some detailed examples within the question and answer document of what does and does not constitute supplantation. Final question, and we realize we've gotten quite a few questions about this so far, is how will procurement work under this solicitation? Non-public schools will be expected to meet the procurement requirements set by the respective intermediate unit, which at a minimum will comply with standard Commonwealth of Pennsylvania guidelines. We are working with relevant stakeholders to flesh this out a little bit more and answer some questions and concerns that have been raised by some of the non-public schools, and we'll be in touch in the future as this application process moves along. That's it for me. Back to you, Sam.
Great. Well, as was mentioned, we have been getting a flurry of questions from you all. So thanks for taking the time to submit some questions. Hopefully some of the ones that we just covered, I see they touch on a lot of the themes that we were getting in our chat here. So let's go through a couple of them that have been submitted so far. And Kirsten and Chris, I'll sort of tag you on some of the ones that I think are most appropriate for you. So the first one that sort of came through was around kind of the difference between the APS one-pager and the non-public schools one-pager. And so Kirsten, I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about sort of, I know that question's come up before, but just a little bit about how folks should navigate that.
Sure. Approved private schools are actually included in section 1301-B of the school code to be eligible for the competitive school safety grants. While they're not specifically delineated in the non-public section, our recommendation would be that approved private schools would focus their efforts or only make application to the competitive school safety grant solicitation, and they do not need to make application to the targeted school safety grant application for non-public schools.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
So a couple other themes. This might be both a Kirsten and a Chris question. So we're getting some questions around the allowable 5% set aside or indirect cost for IUs as like an admin set aside. Should that be something that non-public schools budget for in their ask, or is that something that will be applied on the back end after the awards are recommended?
I'll take that. That would be applied on the back end after awards are recommended. So non-public schools do not have to factor that into their proposed budget.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Another question is around kind of sort of project activities that might exceed the maximum allowed amount. So the example is, say we have to replace all the locks in our school facility and the total cost for that is $150,000. Could we pay? Could we use the grant to cover part of the cost and then the school would pay for the balance? Is that a scenario that is broadly allowable under PCCD's guidelines?
I'll take that one again, Sam. Yes, that would be allowable again, obviously as long as it's a new cost and you're not replacing current funding that was budgeted to replace those locks anyway.
Okay, perfect. Another sort of theme of questions we got is around sort of networked private schools. So this question is around, can we submit one application on behalf of the entire network, or do we need to submit an application for each individual school? Kirsten, do you want to cover that one?
Sure. Our preference is that you submit a single application for each school entity separately, not as like one huge, large single application for the entirety of the network, because we want to consider each entity on its own. We would caution you, though, that occasionally SurveyMonkey is not happy when you submit multiple, or it won't allow you to even submit multiple applications from a single IP or computer. So you need to be cognizant of that as you are moving forward with the SurveyMonkey process. And Sam, since you understand that a little bit more, maybe I'll kick that portion of my response back to you.
Yeah, always fun, right? When you get a tech related question. So I think, the best advice there would be, sometimes folks have used multiple browsers, sometimes that works, but usually IP addresses are really linked to the specific device that you are submitting something on. And so we would recommend that you just have a backup plan. Certainly if you have any concerns or issues that you run into, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. But generally speaking, we would recommend that you have a couple of devices. It could be devices that you own and control. It could be maybe bringing in some colleagues to help out with that process. But again, that's one of the reasons we really encourage you to build your applications and get all of that stuff prepared kind of outside of the SurveyMonkey system, just so that really the last thing that you have to worry about is kind of, submitting stuff in the SurveyMonkey form. And if you are submitting multiple applications, as Kirsten said, I would definitely recommend having some backup plans for some other computers or colleagues you can borrow during that process, just in case SurveyMonkey kind of blocks you from doing that for whatever reason. So with that tech advice aside, I did want to go through a couple more questions. A lot of what we're getting is kind of around fiscal, procurement, all sorts of other things. So this one kind of had to do with sort of who would be responsible for dispersing funds. Is that PCCD or is that the IU? Like, where would the money be going to for the non-public school? And a related question was around whether this was a reimbursement only grant. So Chris, do you want to tackle those areas?
Sure. So when payments are made, payments will be made by PCCD to the intermediate unit. The intermediate unit would then be responsible for paying non-public schools, reimbursing them for costs. So the intermediate unit will eventually submit a report in our e-grant system. We'll pay the intermediate unit. The intermediate unit will then distribute our payment out to the however many non-public schools are within their larger application.
Okay, great. A couple of questions around just process in general. So Kirsten, this might be a good one for you. Can a school, I'm assuming non-public school, apply for itself? You want to tackle that one?
We expect every non-public school to submit the initial request within SurveyMonkey. So yes, you're responsible for doing that. And then if you're recommended for an award, then we'll reach back out to your intermediate unit, and then we'll work with you to get your award finalized through the application that will be submitted for you by the intermediate unit. Does that make sense?
Totally. It made sense
Thank
to me,
you.
I should say.
Thank
We
you,
got a
Sam.
couple of those questions, yeah. And actually, that's a great segue to another question that we received from someone on kind of the IU side of things. So they were wondering if we at PCCD would be providing some type of kind of informal report or update shortly after the application deadline to just ballpark kind of the number of initial request forms that were submitted in their various catchment areas. So for example, 15 of your local non-public schools submitted, just to kind of ballpark what the potential workload might look like for that IU kind of on the back end, or just, providing updates on the review process. So Kirsten, do you want to touch on that one briefly?
Honestly, I don't have an issue with reaching back out to IU, so just kind of give them a heads up as to what applications came in. And we'll be working with IUs throughout this entire process to help facilitate the award.
Wonderful. Chris, this one I think is for you. We've gotten a couple questions around kind of quotes and what you need to get, not get, what you have to include in your application. So is that something that non-public schools need to worry about kind of immediately as they're developing their initial funding request, or is that something that you have some guidance on?
I'm sorry, Sam, what was the item that you were asking about?
Just whether or not non-public schools would need to include in their initial request form, like specific quotes that they got for activities or expenses in their budget.
No, you would not include that in your initial request form.
Perfect. Another question that we're getting, and I apologize, they're coming through, so I'm trying to make sure I'm looking at the right one. This is kind of on a process side about how folks can ensure that they're receiving updates, like signing up for maybe a mailing list or things like that. So I don't know, Kirsten, if we have a place that we want to send folks to for future updates. Certainly signing up for this webinar, I think, is a great first step because we can obviously follow up with folks who registered. But is there any other advice that you would give folks on how to kind of stay connected to our work and receive updates?
I would bookmark our webpage for sure. If we're going to do some kind of mass communication back out to the field via emails that we have, we'll definitely use this listserv, this list that's generated from the folks that are attending the webinar, other email addresses that we have via the Department of Education, and we'll provide updates on our website too. Yeah, that's the main methodology that we have to provide updates to the field.
Okay, perfect. We did get a question. I think we covered this in the FAQs part. So can a non-public school come in for multiple activities as long as it only adds up to the $75,000 max, or is that $75,000 max tied to specific eligible activities? Kirsten, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yes, we want you to come in if for multiple projects up to not exceeding $75,000. It should all add up together to no more than the maximum award amount.
Perfect. Also, I think this will be for you, Kirsten. We got a couple questions around sort of the competitive school safety grant program, and just a sort of advertisement or shameless plug. We will be having a webinar scheduled specifically for the competitive school safety grant program. So be sure to sign up for that if you have questions about this. But I'm just kind of curious, for municipalities, law enforcement agencies who are vendors, APSs, what would your advice be in terms of kind of navigating some of those application procedures?
I'm not entirely sure.
Announcements.
Yeah, cross-funding announcements. If you are working with an approved vendor or a municipality or a local law enforcement agency that is providing services within your school, or you're seeking to have them provide services in their school. I would encourage them to take a strong look at the competitive funding announcement, read through that and see if it makes more sense to have, if they're willing to do it on your behalf, to have the municipality or law enforcement agency or approved vendor to submit an application on your behalf. And it's kind of nice that you have the opportunity, though, if you don't have someone lined up per se, you do have the opportunity to apply for school security personnel services through this targeted school safety grant solicitation as well. So you have two options there. If you have someone in mind and you're working with them, then they're willing to submit an application on your behalf, they can do so through the competitive school safety solicitation. But if you don't, and you're seeking services anyway, you're more than welcome to submit an application through the targeted school safety grant solicitation as well.
Perfect, thank you. We got a couple questions around the $75,000 max. So I can tackle this one, I think, safely. The question was whether it is $75,000 per year or $75,000 over 2 years. And the answer is $75,000 max for the total project period, which can be up to 2 years. So a couple of folks asked that. Hopefully that is helpful. Just taking a look through. The disclaimer was said earlier, but I thanks for all of these wonderful questions. We definitely have dozens of them flying in, so I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. So I'm trying to focus on the ones that are kind of common. But just a reminder that ones we can't get to today, we will be updating our Q&A page with those responses and questions, so folks will be able to check that out soon. And we will make sure to share a link to that page when we send out follow-up materials. So in terms of some other kind of burning questions, I think probably the one I'm seeing pop through is around sort of when a non-public school has to engage their intermediate unit partners. So I think we've covered this a little bit, Kirsten, but can you just confirm sort of, when IUs absolutely have to be engaged, or what the role non-public schools have to play in that sort of IU engagement might look like?
Well, we are aware that all non-public schools have probably what are called Act 89 coordinators within their intermediate unit. You know, good standard practice could be that you give a heads up to your Act 89 coordinator that you're intending to submit an application, but you do not need to engage them at this point if you don't feel like it. I mean, what we're just seeking from you is an initial request form application directly from the non-public school to PCCD. That gets your foot in the door and starts the entire process off. IUs will come into play if you're recommended for an award. That is when we will notify you as the non-public school that you've been recommended for an award. And we will also notify your respective IU at the same time. And then we will begin to work together with everyone to finalize the award in our eGrants system.
Perfect. Thanks, Kirsten.
Mm-hmm.
We had a couple questions come in around baseline criteria and what level is being prioritized, including whether if a school's already met level 1, would it be prioritized to then advance to level 2? So Kirsten, do you want to sort of cover that a little bit?
Actually, Sam, do you mind handling it? I'm sorry,
No, yeah, absolutely. So the answer there is priority consideration is really going to focus on helping schools meet level 1 gaps. So if you're already checking that list out and you're like, we've got all these covered, we're just working towards level 2, we applaud you for that. That's a really great milestone, but the priority consideration for funding is really going to be focused on helping non-public schools meet those level 1 criteria gaps if they exist. And that would be on both the physical security side as well as on the behavioral health side. We'll be sure in the follow-up email to send some explicit links out to the baseline criteria webpage, just so you can check that out in a little bit further detail, but it is in the one pager that's on there as well. So we've covered baseline. A lot of folks asking about application procedures in terms of the SurveyMonkey platform, including whether or not you can save it online and come back to it. Kirsten mentioned this before, but that is technically something. If you're using the same computer, you're using the same device, the same browser, you should be able to return to it. However, there's no guarantees in life or technology, and so that's really why we're encouraging folks to take a look at that reference guide that shows you the questions that are in that survey form. I'll make sure to put that in the announcement section as well. But again, it's in the funding announcement page too. But so yes, technically it saves it, but don't count on it 100%. Make sure that you're putting your work somewhere else that you can return to if needed. We're just about 5 minutes away from the close, and we want to be respectful of folks' time. I just wanted to do a quick skim and see if there's any more questions that are kind of surfacing up to the top.
Hey, Sam, I did see one that if a school has submitted a SurveyMonkey already, like an initial request form already, but wants to change it after this webinar, is that possible? And the answer to that question is yes. We're going to be using the same process that we use for our nonprofit security grant fund solicitation. And that is, we get a lot of folks that submit an application, but it might be incomplete, or they think of other things they want to add. So we're fine with you submitting a revised version of your application if you feel the need to do so. We will accept applications right up to the end of the February 29th deadline. The only caveat to that is that we do sort for duplicate applications that are submitted from your organization. So we will usually go with the last submitted application, but you are more than welcome to revise your application based on the information that you've received, or if you come across any other ideas or thoughts that you want to do to revise your application.
Wonderful. Thanks for flagging that one, Kirsten.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're sort of hitting our max of things we can actually answer. Thanks for bearing with us. We love the level of participation. Like we said, we'll be hard at work going through the many questions that you all submitted and making sure that we can come up with some answers for those on the page. I'm going to go ahead and sort of close out the chat and move us to closing out our time here. So Kirsten, any final words before we move to close on the webinar?
No, I do not. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sam, if you want to wrap it up, go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, we said it before, but we'll say it again. We want to thank you all for your participation in today's webinar session. We certainly appreciate your time and your interest. As a reminder, and I know a lot of you were asking about this, a recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the presentation slides are going to all be made available on our website, and we will follow up with an email directing you to all those links and resources as soon as they are ready. We certainly encourage you to carefully review the funding announcement and related materials that are available on our website, including the funding announcement Q&As that have been submitted and answered to date. Again, we'll link to those in our follow-up email. If you do have any lingering questions, please don't hesitate to contact PCCD staff via email using that designated email address that's referenced in the funding announcement and that Kirsten flagged earlier. And again, thank you all so very much. And we hope you have a great rest of your day and good luck with the remainder of the application process. And we look forward to seeing what you all submit. So thanks so much. Have a good one.